evening, everyone. I'm almost mixed up on my days. It's a pleasure to see everybody here. I'm excited for tonight. We have a special guest in the house. Many of us have ventured out and maybe have ventured out to the Holy Land, but tonight we have a special guest speaker all the way from Israel. He's a renowned speaker, activist, author, and most recently he has a podcast that he was like, I want you to highlight it. I want you guys to know about it. So it's Eyes on Israel, and the way that you can look it up is you can look up Israel 365. Eyes on Israel is his podcast, but he speaks about a lot of different topics. And I think that it's important for us, especially in our cultural moment, to have people that are involved in the religious dialogue all across the globe. We are the local church, but we also are a global church. And so tonight we're going to be able to hear from somebody that's not new to Texas, but new to Lubbock. So please welcome with me, Rabbi Pesach.
Thank you. Oh, so good to get a standing ovation before I said anything. My wife asks me how it went. Well, I got a standing ovation. Thank you. Please be seated. So, first of all, is there anyone here for the first time tonight? No? Everyone here has been here before. Good. Because sometimes, you show up in a church for the first time and there's an Orthodox rabbi speaking. It could be a kind of like, where am I? It's all good. Thank you, and thank you, Pastor, for thank you for opening your home. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. So yes, I live in Israel. I live in the town of Beit Shemesh, about a half-hour drive outside Jerusalem. I live about a 10-minute drive from the Elah Valley where David killed Goliath. When I leave the town of Beit Shemesh, I drive over the Sorek River where Samson met Delilah, got into some trouble. So it's a good place to live with all the trouble we're having. But there's nowhere else I'd rather be, except maybe Lubbock. I'd like to speak about the war tonight. But really, I'd like to speak about war in general from a biblical perspective. Because when we're following an event like a war, and I'm sure many of you here have been following the events from Israel, we get lost in the headlines, we get lost in the details. We get caught up in the details. What's happening today? What happened yesterday? What's the latest political pressure that the Biden administration is putting on Israel? What's the newest way they're betraying us? And they are. And we can lose the broader perspective of what's actually happening. And that's where the Bible comes in. We need the Bible to ground us, to give us the big view. Because the Bible is not only one piece of the story, the Bible is the whole story. So what I'd like to do tonight is really look at a passage in the Bible that speaks about war. It speaks about this war in particular, the war we're fighting right now, the war that my children, my sons, and my son-in-law are fighting in Gaza. But before I get to the scripture that I want to discuss, I first want to plant an image in your minds to help us focus. And that is an event that took place on November 29th in the city of New York. In New York City, every year right after Thanksgiving, there's an event that's held where there's a Christmas tree lighting at Rockefeller Plaza. You've heard of this before? Right? And the Christmas tree lighting at Rockefeller Plaza is the traditional kickoff to the Christmas season in New York, to the Christmas shopping season. And they make a whole ceremony out of it, and people come down with their families, and it's this big deal because it's this massive tree, and they light up the Christmas tree, and the Christmas season begins in New York City. But this year, on November 29th, a few months ago, at the Christmas tree lighting, there was a mob of pro-Hamas, anti-Israel demonstrators who showed up. And they were chanting, "Long live the Intifada," and from the river to the sea, and Christmas is canceled. And they turned it into a riot, and it got violent, and they ruined the Christmas tree lighting at Rockefeller Plaza. Now, what's particularly interesting about this event is, for fear of stating the obvious, Jews don't celebrate Christmas. It's not a Jewish holiday. Israel is not a Christian country. We have a 2% Christian minority. They're doing very nicely. It's a growing Christian population. They live and worship freely. But Israel is not really a Christian country. Is this obvious? Why on earth does it make sense to our enemies on the progressive left to disrupt a Christmas tree lighting to protest Israel? Because it obviously makes sense to them. They felt it appropriate to disrupt Christmas because of their opposition to Israel. And just in case we think that it's an aberration of some whack jobs in New York, am I allowed to say whack jobs? Okay. Just in case we think it's an aberration, around the same time, during the weeks leading up to Christmas, there were similar demonstrations in London, England, where Piccadilly Circus and Oxford Street, the fancy shopping areas where you have all the Christmas lights. There were demonstrations, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel demonstrations, also screaming Christmas is canceled because of their opposition to Israel. And in Italy, where every year there's an opera, a Christmas opera that's put on at the La Scala Opera House, the Christmas celebration opera this year was interrupted by pro-Hamas demonstrators who disrupted the performance in the name of opposing Israel. Jews don't celebrate Christmas, but it made sense to these anti-Israel demonstrators to disrupt Christmas because of their opposition to Israel. Now, we might be inclined to look at them and say they're fools, like queers for Palestine. Do you know what will happen to you if you move to Gaza? Now, so we laugh at them, right? But here's the problem. When we laugh at them, or we just think about how idiotic they are, we stop thinking about what they're actually doing, because we just dismiss them as fools. These are not stupid people. They're terribly misguided, demonically so. But we have to think about what they are actually doing. Why does it make sense to them? Because if we don't get to the bottom of that, we don't understand this war. If we think for a moment that this war is a war between a particular Muslim terrorist group in Israel fighting against the Israelis and against the Jews, and that's what it's about, we're missing the point, and our enemies just told us by protesting Christmas. And if we broaden the question and ask ourselves why progressive, atheist, trans activists are pro-Hamas, who are no fans of the trans community, queers for Palestine, if we wonder about that and say, oh, they're just fools, we're missing what the war is about. Why does it make sense to them? And folks, it makes sense to them because of what we have in common. The same jihadists who are slaughtering Christians in Nigeria would be more than happy to slaughter Jews if there were any Jews in Nigeria. Because they know that what we share is our faith in the Bible. And there's nothing they fear more than proof that the Bible is true. And there's no greater evidence that the prophecies of the Bible are real and true, then the ingathering of millions of Jews to the land of Israel after an exile of thousands of years in fulfillment of multitudes of biblical prophecies. So they must stand against Israel for the same reason that they stand against all the values that we hold dear in the culture war you're fighting here in America. The war Israel's fighting against Hamas and the cultural battles that you're fighting here, right here in Lubbock, are the same war, just different fronts. Now there's a famous verse, a famous passage in Ecclesiastes which speaks about how there's a time for everything. Very famous passage in the Bible. It almost sounds like a nursery rhyme. You know, what does it say there? There's a time to weep and a time to laugh and a time to mourn and a time to dance. You know this? Everyone know this passage? It's a time for everything. And the final line of it says, there's a time for war and a time for peace. And it sounds like a very simple verse. Time for war, time for peace. Like I said, it sounds almost like a nursery rhyme. Folks, this verse, there's a time for war and a time for peace, is a very, very difficult verse. It's very difficult. It's a very challenging verse. It's not simple at all. Let me explain. This verse, a time for war and a time for peace, is not written to two different people. It's written to each and every one of us. And what the verse is saying is that you must know what time it is. Because if it's a time for war, and you think it's a time for peace, and you treat it that way, you will make terrible, terrible mistakes. Let me say that again. If it's a time for war, and you treat it like a time for peace, you will make grave errors. What this passage in Ecclesiastes is telling us is that you must know what time it is. Now, it's also true if it's a time for peace and you treat it like a time for war, that's also a problem. We know people like that. But that's not an easy pivot to make. You see, as people of faith, we like a time for peace. Time for peace is fun. It's good. It's pleasant. We want it to be a time for peace and be peacemakers. And that's who this verse is talking to. It's saying, okay, it's good that you feel that way, but you know what? There's a time for war. And we don't get to choose what time it is. Our enemies have a say. But we better be clear about what time it is. So I'd like to delve into war in the time we have. And we're going to look at, if you want to find the passage on your phone or in your Bible in front of you, we're going to be taking a look at Psalm 83. Let me explain why Psalm 83. Psalm 83 is a psalm about war. It's a psalm that was also chosen by the chief rabbis of the Israeli Defense Forces, of the Israeli army, to be read at the funeral of every fallen soldier. Every soldier who falls in combat, at their funeral, Psalm 83 is read. And it's not a funeral type of psalm. This isn't like Psalm 23. And in the early days of this war, I was at the funeral of a young man by the name of Yosef Malachi Gedalia, the son of one of my best friends, grew up around the corner, who was in a commando unit. He was killed on October 7th in Kfar Aza, defending that town from the attack on October 7th. And I went to his funeral, and at the funeral, the officiating rabbi from the army read Psalm 83, and it hit me hard. And I realized why it was chosen. And ever since then, I recite it every day, 3 times a day. After each of my daily prayers, I recite Psalm 83. And I'd like to go through some of the verses in Psalm 83 with you, because what Psalm 83 really is it's the answer to the challenge I raised from Ecclesiastes, that it's a time for war. Okay, it's a time for war. What does that mean? How do I, as someone of biblical perspective, make that transition from a time for peace to a time for war? How do I approach a time for war? What is war about, biblically speaking? And what you'll find, and what I found when I delved into Psalm 83, is that it's not only about war, but it happens to be about this war that we're fighting right now, and I'll show that to you. So let's take a look. A psalm of Asaph. O God, do not keep silence. Do not hold your peace or be still, O God. For behold, your enemies make an uproar. Those who hate you have raised their heads. They lay crafty plans against your people. They consult together against your treasured ones. We'll get onto it in a moment, but let's first point something out. We speak about the enemies of Israel as God's enemies. Your enemies, those who hate you. And that seems like a pretty arrogant thing for the king of Israel. Well, it's actually, he didn't write that. This isn't the David psalm, it's an Asaph psalm. But it's a pretty arrogant thing for us Jews to say, if you're an enemy of Israel, you're an enemy of God. Oh, really? Let me explain. It's not an arrogant thing. Let me explain where it's coming from. You see, how do we know God? Oh, it's a big question. How do we know that God is God? Well, remarkably, God tells us how to know that he's God. Over and over again, there's a phrase that appears in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, over and over again. And they shall know that I am the Lord. And they shall know that I am the Lord. That phrase, you could look it up in a concordance. Appears over and over again in the Bible. And they shall know that I am the Lord, especially in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel loved that phrase. And they shall know that I am the Lord. If you look up that phrase in the Bible, you will find that almost every time it appears, it's talking about the same thing. It's talking about the ingathering of the nation of Israel to our land after a very long exile. And God says, that's how you know that I'm God. Why is that the way to know that he's God? Because it's a unique event in history. No other nation of the many, many nations from the ancient world who went into exile, the only one that ever came back is the nation of Israel, and God said that we would. Completely breaks the rules of history. And that's how God reveals himself. I don't want to get too theologically deep here in this brief moment because I want to get back to some other things, but let me just make this point clear. The way God displays himself is through miracles. That's what he did in Egypt, right? The way Egypt all recognized God finally at the end of the plagues was he did miracles. So what does God do? He sets up rules, and that's nature, or the way the world runs. And then he periodically breaks the rules to show himself. Right? So, for example, if every time you were running away from someone chasing you and there was a body of water and you jumped in, it would split and then drown them when they went in after you, if that's the way things always worked, then the splitting of the Red Sea wasn't a miracle because that's the way things happen. Right? The reason it's a miracle is because it only happened once. And it breaks the rules of nature. Right? That's how miracles work. That's how God reveals himself. Again, God sets up a system, and then he reveals himself by breaking the rules every now and then and saying that that's why he's doing it. God did the same thing with history. How does God show himself as master of history? Same way. He sets up rules for history, and this is how nations are governed. Nations that go into exile vanish. That's what happened to hundreds and hundreds of nations from the ancient world. They went into exile and they ceased to exist and they assimilated and new identities were formed, except one, the nation of Israel. He sent us into exile, but he said it would happen before, right? He said before it happened, he said, you're going to go into exile and you're going to survive a long exile for thousands of years, and then you're going to come back to your land and it's going to break all the rules of history. And you shall know, and then everyone will know that I'm God, because I'm breaking the rules. So the nation of Israel returning to our land and reconstituting ourselves as a people is not about us. We're pawns in God's big game. The purpose of the Jewish people is not the Jewish people. The purpose of the Jewish people is that we're the tool that God uses with our unusual, unique history to reveal himself to the world. Get it? Does that make sense? Good. If it didn't, talk to me afterwards. We don't have time for questions. Okay, so that's why the enemies of Israel who try to prevent us from being in the land are the enemies of God. They're trying to prevent the revelation of God. That's the meaning behind this. You'll see this will come in more focus later on. They lay crafty plans against your people. They consult together against your treasured ones. They say, "Come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more." Notice, let us wipe them out as a nation. We don't want Israel to be a nation anymore, from the river to the sea. That's what our enemies are saying today. The nation of Israel is illegitimate. They don't want Israel to be a nation, right? You could be a religion, but you can't be a nation. Come, let us wipe them out as a nation. For they conspire with one accord. Against you they make a covenant. Now, here, I've got to show you something really, really interesting. There's now a list of enemies of Israel in verses 6, 7, 8. We list these nations. Now, look, pay close attention here. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gaval and Ammon and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. Now, do you notice that change? When you're reading the Bible, you have to read carefully. I find that a lot of people, Jews and Christians, they read the Bible, but they kind of skim. They don't read it carefully. Every word in the Bible is there for a reason. And when you have a pattern that breaks in the Bible, sometimes it'll be a tense change, or in Psalms, you'll have this a lot where you're talking about God, and then suddenly the Psalm shifts and you're talking to God. All these little shifts, you got to pay close attention to them. They're all worthy of study. And here, what you have is a list of nations, and they're all connected with the word "and," except for two of them. Let me say it again. Now I'll stress it. Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gabal and Ammon and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. Why did we suddenly shift from "and" to "with"? Is that a good question? Sounds like a nitpicky question. Us rabbis get very nitpicky, legalistic, right? Rabbis. This is how we get to the truth. When you see these little things, these little extra words or shifts in words, strange breaks in patterns, that's where you mark the spot with an X and you dig, because that's often the most important lessons in the Bible. So why are Philistia and Tyre, those two places, linked with the word "with," where all the other ones are just and? Anyone know where Philistia is on a map? Anyone? Where'd the Philistines live? It's called the Gaza Strip. That's Philistine territory in the Bible. Look at a biblical map, you'll see it's the same spot. Anyone know where Tyre is? Anyone? South Lebanon, the southern part of Lebanon. Here in this psalm, we're talking about the enemies of Israel who are coming against us, but there's two of them that are uniquely linked. They're more bonded together than the others. The Gaza Strip and the southern part of Lebanon. Isn't that what's happening today? Those are the two fronts that we're fighting right now, the Gaza Strip, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. So this psalm is very much about our war, destroying Israel as a nation, from the river to the sea, let the name of Israel be mentioned no more, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre, and then we move on. Now we ask God to destroy them, to help us in defeating them. I'm not going to delve into this too much. It mentions a bunch of nations that fought against Israel in the Bible, and we want God to wipe them out. Do to them as you did to Midian and to Sisera and Yavin at the river Kishon, who were destroyed at Endor, who became dung for the ground. Interesting. Became dung for the ground, like Like we just want to insult our enemies. Not only are we going to destroy you, but you're going to be like dung. No. These images are chosen very deliberately. This is the Bible. Dung is not just gross and smelly, it's also fertilizer. Something grows from it. The destruction of evil is productive. The destruction of evil leads to growth. So our enemies are to be made, we're asking God to make them like dung, that their destruction should actually lead to growth. Let's keep going. Make their nobles like Oreb and Ze'ev and the princes like Zebach and Salmunah, who said, let us take possession for ourselves of the pastures of God. They want the land for themselves. They want to say that it's theirs. Oh my God, make them like a whirling dust, like chaff before the wind, as fire consumes the forest, as flame sets the mountains ablaze, so may you pursue them with your tempest and terrify them with your, it says here, hurricane, with your strong wind. Now, here things get really interesting. Another rule about reading the Bible carefully. The Bible does not contain italics or underline or bold-faced type, right? The way the Bible emphasizes things is through repetition, right? When something's said in the Bible, and you didn't need to be said that, repetition in the Bible is emphasis. Okay, remember that. Anytime you're reading the Bible and you read something that either it's information you were already told and you're being told it again, or it's just a doubling of a phrase, that's the Bible's way of focusing you in on that point, of underlining it, so to speak, okay? Important rule. Keep that in your pocket when you're studying the Bible. So here, watch what happens. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek your name, O Lord. Let them be put to shame and dismayed forever. Let them perish in disgrace. Okay, here the translator just got tired of saying shame. In Hebrew, it's the same word again. It says shame 3 times. 3 times in the span of 2 verses, we ask God for our enemies to be filled with shame. Couldn't have said it once? Obviously, the psalmist wants us to focus in on this, and it's also right near the end, right? Like, you make them like chaff, like the whirling dust, all these other things we said once, and then we're like, we want them to be ashamed. Now, this just sounds like piling on. If I'm fighting my enemy wants to destroy me as a nation and wipe me out from the face of the earth, isn't it just enough to defeat them? Why do I also want them to be ashamed? Like, it's not enough that I beat them, they should also be ashamed. I'm just piling on? No. Shame, let's talk about shame for a moment. Anyone spacing out? You can start listening now and you'll get something good. Okay? Don't worry, you didn't miss much. This next couple minutes is worth it on its own. Shame is a very important emotion. It's actually a very valuable emotion. It's very positive, actually. It sounds weird to say that, but it is. Let me explain. If I describe someone and say, that person has no shame, that guy's got no shame, usually that's an insult. There's only 2 ways that a person could have no shame. Either they've actually never done anything wrong, nothing to be ashamed of, highly rare. The other possibility is that the person has done things that are wrong, but it doesn't bother them. They're not ashamed. See, what shame is, listen carefully to this definition of shame. I made it up. Shame, the amount of shame a person feels, is a measure of the distance that they feel between what they did wrong and how they see themselves. Let me say that again. Shame, the amount of shame you feel, is a measure of the distance between what you've done wrong and how you see yourself. For example, let me give a simple example. Let's say I've never lied. I wish that were true. Let's say I've never told a lie in my life and I tell a lie for the first time. You ever do a sin for the first time? No, you don't answer out loud. You feel really ashamed, right? Terrible, it's eating away at you because you did this thing you've never done before. Why do you feel that shame? Because you're not a liar and you lied. There's a gap between what you did and how you see yourself. But let's say you start lying a lot. The shame goes away. Why? Because the gap between what you did and how you see yourself is narrowing until it's gone. And that's why sometimes people who come to faith later in life feel retroactive shame for things that they didn't feel ashamed of before. Why? Because there was no gap between what they did and how they saw themselves, and now there is. So they look back and they go, oh my gosh, I did that? That's not who I am. They have this gap. Shame is the distance between what you've done wrong and how you see yourself. So shame's very valuable. We don't want to identify with the bad things we've done, so we feel ashamed of them. And that's why we're asking God, more than any other request, it's repeated 3 times in a row, that we want our enemies to be ashamed. In other words, we care about them. We want them to recognize that what they've done is evil. These kids on Ivy League campuses screaming from the river to the sea and demonizing Israel, they're not ashamed. They're proud. They feel self-righteous. When I say I want them to be ashamed, it's because I want them to recognize the evil of what they're saying and what they're doing. I want the enemies we're fighting in Gaza to recognize the evil of what they're saying, of what they're doing, so that they feel ashamed, because they don't feel ashamed. You had terrorists who committed atrocities on October 7th. There are recordings of a young terrorist who killed 10 Israelis, calling home to his dad, bragging, saying, "Dad, I killed 10 Jews today." Like some kids get called home to say that they scored a touchdown. That's not shame, that's pride. We want them to feel ashamed because we want them to recognize the truth, which leads us to the end of the psalm. Let them perish in disgrace, that they may know that you alone, whose name is the Lord, are most high over all the earth. The goal of war, the purpose of war, is to bring clarity and truth. We must win so that God will reign. We must win so that good defeats evil. There was a generation that fought World War II that looked evil in the eye in Imperial Japan and in Nazi Germany, and knew that it is the duty of good people to defeat evil, even if it means laying down your life to do so. And they saw things clearly. And that clarity of vision is sorely lacking today. And the only people who can reclaim it, the only force in America that is strong enough to defeat the progressive left, is American Christianity. The Jews can do their part. We're very small, those traditional faithful Jews. But only Christianity is big enough and strong enough to defeat the left. And that's your part of this war. We're all fighting the same war together. Remember what happened in Rockefeller Plaza on November 29th. Our enemies know that they're trying to take down all those who have biblical faith. So they hate the Jews in Israel and they hate Christians. And we better get that message too. When you stand for Israel today, when you pray for Israel, when you give from your funds to help what we're doing in Israel, when you do all that today, you're not helping the Jews fight their battle over there. You're doing your part because this is all the same war. I'm out of time. I just want to end with a couple housekeeping things about what I do, the organization I work for. There's a few slides. So first of all, I represent an organization called Israel 365, and we have an action arm called Israel 365 Action. You go to the website, Israel365action.com, and it will not ask you for money. It will ask you to put your name and your email in so that we can send you action items that you can do on behalf of Israel from your phone, from your home. please sign up for the action list, Israel365action.com. You can take that QR code to support our work. And please watch my show, Eyes on Israel. It's on Real America's Voice Network. If you're familiar with that network, it's the same network that Charlie Kirk is on, that Steve Bannon is on. It's a new weekly show. We launched it a month ago every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. That's 2 p.m. here, but you could also watch it online. Just look up Eyes on Israel, and you'll get real truth about what's going on the ground from Israel. And also I have a book. If you like this biblical teaching, the real thing I love to do is biblical teachings, and I've written, my latest book is called Verses for Zion, and it's got 77, that's the number that came out. There's no significance to it. Maybe there is, and I don't know. There's 77 short teachings where I take a Bible verse and I dig down into it, usually digging down into the original Hebrew, and I pull out a lesson like I did here tonight. And you can use it as a devotional. It's a great way to support our work. And if you enjoyed this teaching, you enjoy this type of thing, please buy my book, Verses for Zion. You can get it at the Israel 365 store. So that's Israel365store.com. You could find the book there. And folks, I came here to make relationships. I want to stay in touch. I'm very easy to find. I'm the only person in the world named Pesach Wolicki. So it makes me really easy to find. Find me online, stay in touch with me. God bless you, and thank you. Thank you so much for opening your home.
Thank you, Rabbi.